This is part 2 of the introduction to the Oera Linda book, translated from Frisian to Dutch by Dr. J. Ottema and translated from Dutch to English by William Sandbach. Equally remarkable are the forms of their figures. We usually call our figures Arabian, although they have not the least resemblance to those used by the Arabs. The Arabians did not bring their ciphers from the East, because the Semitic nations used the whole alphabet in writing numbers. The manner of expressing all numbers by 10 signs the Arabs learned in the West, though the form was in some measure corresponding with their writing, and was written from left to right, after the Western fashion. Our ciphers seem here to have sprung from the Frise ciphers, sifar, which form had the same origin as the handwriting, and is derived from the lines of the Yule. The book, as it lies before us, consists of 2 parts, differing widely from each other, and of dates very far apart. The writer of the first part calls herself Adela, wife of Apol, chief man of the Linda country. This is continued by her son Adelbrost and her daughter Apollonia. The first book, running from page 1 to 88, is written by Adele. The following part, from page 88 to 94, is begun by Adelbrost and continued by Apollonia. The second book, running from page 94 to 114, is written by Apollonia. Much later, perhaps 250 years, a third book is written, from page 114 to 134, by Fretheric. Then follows from page 134 to 143, written by his widow, Willio. After that, from page 144 to 169 by their son, Conerid, and then from page 169 to 192 by their grandson, Bedin. Pages 193 and 194, with which the last part must have begun, are wanting. Therefore the writer is unknown. He may probably have been a son of Bedin. On page 134, Willio makes mention of another writing of Adila. These she names Thet Bok Therasanga, Thet Bok Theratelinga, and Thet Helenia Bok, and afterwards Thaskrifta von Adila Jeftha Helenia. To fix the date, we must start from the year 1256 of our era, when Hido Oera Linda made the copy, in which he says that it was 3,449 years after Atland was sunk. This disappearance of the old land, Outland or Atland, was known by the Greeks, for Plato mentions in his Timaeus 24 the disappearance of Atlantis, the position of which was only known as somewhere far beyond the Pillars of Hercules. From this writing it appears that it was land stretching far out to the west of Jutland, of which Heligoland and the islands of North Friesland are the last barren remnants. This event, which occasioned a great dispersion of the Frisian race, became the commencement of a chronological reckoning corresponding with 2193 before Christ, and is known by geologists as the Cimbrian flood. On page 80 begins an account in the year 1602, after the disappearance of Outland, and thus in the year 591 before Christ. And on page 82 is the account of the murder of Frena, Eremoder, of Tierland 2 years later, that is, in 589. When, therefore, Adila commences her writing with her own coming forward in an assembly of the people 30 years after the murder of the Eremoder, which is the Great Mother, that must have been in the year 559 before Christ. In the part written by her daughter Apollonia, we find that 15 months after the assembly, Adila was killed by the Finns in an attack by surprise of Texland. This must accordingly have happened 557 years before Christ. Hence it follows that the first book, written by Adila, was of the year 558 before Christ. The second book, by Apollonia, we may assign to about the year 530 before Christ. The latter part contains the history of the known kings of Friesland, Friso Adel, also known as Ubo, and Asega Askar, called Black Adel. Of the third king, Ubo, nothing is said, or rather that part is lost, as the pages 169 to 188 are missing. Fretheric, the first writer who appears now, was a contemporary of the occurrences which he relates, namely the arrival of Friso. He was a friend of Luidgert den Geertman, who, as rear admiral of the fleet of Wichirte, the Sea King, had come with Friso in the year 303 before Christ, 1,890 years after the disappearance of Atland. He has borrowed most of his information from the logbook of Luidgert. The last writer gives himself out most clearly as a contemporary of Black Adel, or Askar, about the middle of his reign, which Frumerius states to have been from 70 before Christ to 11 after the birth of Christ, the same period as Julius Caesar and Augustus. He therefore wrote in the middle of the last century before Christ and knew of the conquest of Gaul by the Romans. It is thus evident that there elapsed fully 2 centuries before the two parts of the work. Of the Gauls, we read on page 84 that they were called the missionaries of Sidon, and on page 124 that the Gauls are Druids. The Gauls, then, were Druids, and the name Galli, used for the whole nation, was really only the name of an order of priesthood brought from the east, just as among the Romans the Gallis were the priests of Sibyl. The whole contents of the book are in all respects new. That is to say, there is nothing in it that we were acquainted with before. What we here read of Friso, Adel, and Askar differs entirely from what is related by our own chroniclers, or rather presents it in quite another light. For instance, they all relate that Friso came from India, and that thus the Frisians were of Indian descent, and yet they add that Friso was a German and belonged to a Persian race, which Herodotus called Germans. According to the statement in this book, Friso did not come from India and with the fleet of Nearchus, but he is not therefore an Indian. He is of Frisian origin, of Fria's people. He belongs, in fact, to a Frisian colony which, after the death of Nehelenia, 15.5 centuries before Christ, under the guidance of a priestess Geert, settled in the Punjab and took the name of Geertmen. The Geertmen were known by only one of the Greek writers, Strabo, who mentions them as Greek word that I can't pronounce, differing totally and entirely from the another Greek word I can't pronounce, in manners, language, and religion. The historians of Alexander's expedition do not speak of Frisians or Geertmen, though they mention Indo-Scythians, thereby describing a people who live in India, but whose origin is in the distant unknown north. In the accounts of Luidgert, no names are given of the plains where the Frieslanders lived in India. We only know that they first established themselves to the east of the Punjab, and afterwards moved to the west of those rivers. It is mentioned, moreover, as a striking fact that in the summer the sun at midday was straight above their heads. They therefore lived within the tropics. We find in Ptolemy, see the map of Kiepert, exactly 24 degrees north on the west side of Indus, the name Minagara, and about 6 degrees east of that, in 22 degrees north, another Minagara. This name is pure Frise, the same as Valhallagara, Folsgara, and comes from Minna, the name of an aeromotor who in whose time the voyages of Teunis and his nephew Inca took place. The coincidence is too remarkable to be accidental, and not to prove that Minagara was the headquarters of the Frisian colony. The establishment of the colonists in the Punjab in 1551 before Christ, and their journey thither, we find fully described in Adila's book, and with the mention of one most remarkable circumstance, namely that the Frisian mariners sailed through the strait which in those times still ran into the Red Sea. In Strabo, Book I, pages 38 and 50, it appears that Eratosthenes was acquainted with the existence of the strait, in which the later geographers make no mention. It existed still in the time of Moses, Exodus 14:2, for he encamped at Pi-ha-Kairot, the mouth of the strait, probably. Moreover, Strabo mentions that Sesostris made an attempt to cut through the isthmus, but that he was not able to accomplish it. That in very remote times the sea really did flow through is proved by the result of the geological investigations on the isthmus made by the Suez Canal Commission, of which M. Renaud presented a report to the Academy of Sciences on the 19th of June, 1856. In that report, among other things, appears the following. Okay, there's a lot of French writing here. Let's see if I can do this. Une question fort controversée est celle de savoir si à l'époque où les Hébreux fouillaient de l'Égypte sous la conduite de Moïse, les lacs amers faisant encore partie de la mer Rouge. Cette dernière hypothèse s'accorderait mieux que les hypothèses contraires avec le texte du livre sacré. Mais alors il faudrait admettre que depuis l'époque des Moïse, les seuls de Suez seraient sortis des eaux. Sorry, guys. With regard to this question, it is certainly of importance to fall in with an account in this Frisian manuscript, from which it seems that in the 16th century before Christ, the connection between the Bitter Lakes and the Red Sea still existed, and that the strait was still navigable. The manuscript further states that soon after the passage of the Geertmen there was an earthquake, that the land rose so high that all the water ran out, and all the shallows and alluvial lands rose up like a wall. This must have happened after the time of Moses, so that at the date of the Exodus, 1564 BC, the track between Suez and the Bitter Lakes was still navigable, but could be forded dry-foot at low water. This point, then, is the commencement of the isthmus, after the forming of which the northern inlet was certainly soon filled up as far as the Gulf of Pelusium.